Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Gary Becker, who will deliver the 19th Institute of Economic Affairs Annual Hayek Memorial Lecture. The Hayek Lecture is one of the highlights of the IEA's annual programme. It provides a unique forum to present ideas that demonstrate how life in Britain and the wider world can be improved through free market economics and the empowerment of people which results. Friedrich Hayek himself, of course, won a Nobel Prize for his contribution to economic science in 1974, and this lecture is dedicated to his memory. It's interesting to note in this context that earlier this month, after being featured by a prominent US media commentator, Hayek's Road to Serfdom became the #1 bestseller on Amazon. Indeed, our own condensed version on the IEA website has already been downloaded over 20,000 times in the month of June alone, more than the total number of downloads in all of 2009. Professor Becker attended Hayek's seminars at Chicago University, and like Hayek, he has made several profound contributions to economic thinking. One of his greatest achievements has been to demonstrate the centrality of economics across many areas of life. Professor Becker's contribution in the field of economics has been immense. Over the decades, his influence has stretched into subjects as far-ranging as crime, drug addiction, behavioural patterns within families, and the value of time. A friend and pupil of Milton Friedman's, as well as Hayek's, Professor Becker has, in turn, influenced and inspired those around him, including economists such as Steve Levitt, author of Freakonomics. Professor Becker has consistently received great public acclaim for his work, himself winning the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economic Science in 1992. His Nobel lecture focused on the economic way of looking at behaviour and reflected aspects of his research agenda on human capital, the economics of the family, and the economic analysis of crime, discrimination, and population. Since then, his significant contribution to economics has been recognised in various other ways. In 2000, he won the National Medal of Science, and in 2007, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is currently University Professor at the University of Chicago's Department of Economics and Sociology and Professor at the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business. His current research is focusing on habits and addictions as well as on population growth. He'll be speaking tonight on the theme of immigration. This is a topic of great concern in the UK, as evidenced by the debate around this issue during the general election campaign. And although it is an emotive subject, it is a vital one. Whilst there was much debate during the lead-up to the election about the numbers of people who should be allowed to come to Britain, there was little discussion of the way in which bureaucratic and central planning procedures are still used to determine whether we have skills shortages and so on. Professor Becker's proposals can provide a mechanism that enables the government to implement its policy on immigration with much better economic outcomes. I'm therefore delighted that Professor Becker can be here in the UK to give the 19th Institute of Economic Affairs Annual Hayek Memorial Lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Gary Becker.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak on the Hayek lecture. As it was mentioned, I attended Professor Hayek's seminar. I always think of him as Professor Hayek. Seminars at Chicago. They were evening seminars, very stimulating. He had leading figures at the University of Chicago from all disciplines. Enrico Fermi from physics, Sewell Wright from great biologists, Milton Friedman, and others who spoke before them. I also knew quite well Arthur Selden and Ralph Harris, the two founders of this institute. I met them primarily through the Mount Pelerin Society meetings, where they were both active, and I became active after a while. And Arthur Selden asked me at several occasions to write something. It's a long time ago, but I think I wrote one or two things for the Institute. So it's a double pleasure to be here giving the Hayek lecture at the Institute for Economic Affairs with my fond memories of both Hayek, Lord Harris became Lord Harris, and Arthur Selden. Now the topic this evening is immigration. Clearly, as was mentioned, a very controversial subject all over, and here in Great Britain, but also in the United States, in Japan, in continental Europe, and Mexico. They think of it from a different way than the United States does, but still a big subject in Mexico and in many other countries of the world. And I'm going to, my talk is going to be built around a number of slides, so you can all follow what I'm going to say. Despite the controversy over immigration continues to grow. So what I want to do in this presentation is first discuss the reasons for this worldwide growth in immigration, and then present a proposal, what I call a radical solution. Now, whether it's a solution or not, that it's up to you to decide, but I think it'll go a long way toward reconciling the different approaches and different attitudes toward immigration. And the solution will be based on using the price mechanism, which is so important in organizing economic activities in general, but has really not been applied to the immigration area, to my knowledge, in any systematic fashion. Now, one of the sources of the large levels of immigration is obvious, that there are substantial differences between rich and poor countries, and these differences have not really closed very much over time. If you look for since 1970, last 40 years, what I plot along here is the income per capita of the top half of richest countries and income per capita of the bottom half of countries. And you can see that there's been some convergence, mainly because of the rapid growth of India and China, which get a lot of weight in the lower income countries. But even with all that, the gap is smaller than it was initially, but it's still very substantial. So when you have a big gap between poor and rich countries, obviously poor people want to improve their economic circumstances, and they have a desire, many of them, to move to rich countries. So that's one fundamental source of it that has continued and will continue to exist into the future. Another factor, particularly important for Europe, is low fertility, that is, low numbers of children being born. In virtually every single European country, East, Central, and Western Europe, total fertility rate is below replacement. That is, on the average, the typical woman has less than 2 children over her lifetime. So you have a dearth of young people. That problem is going to get worse, not better. Most immigrants are young, and the combination of these two factors with the difference in income explains the great pressure for a lot of people to move and better themselves and their children. So here I plot for the number of countries who have below replacement fertility, that is below roughly 2 children per family. You can see there were very few countries in 1970, but it's grown steadily in 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2006, the latest figures I have. And now over 80 countries of the world have below replacement fertility, a remarkable revolution. I mean, it's a topic, since I've been interested, I can spend another few lectures. I'll come back and give another lecture on that subject at some point, because it's such a fundamental change in the way the world will be as we look forward. Almost half the world's population now live in countries with below replacement fertility. So given those forces, low incomes, people want to move here, low birth rates in the richer countries of the world. These are mainly richer countries, not entirely. You can see the great pressure to move. So if you look at what happened to world immigration, this is net immigration. So it looks at, say, for a particular region, how many people are coming in relative to how many people are leaving, and it nets that out. So for some problems, maybe gross immigration, number of people coming in would be a better measure, but the data I'm going to show are mainly net. You can see there's been a large growth since 1970 in the amount of world net immigration, and you see the growth in Europe, very substantial. North America, very substantial. Some regions have had a growing deficit, that people are leaving these regions, and other regions have been fairly neutral. Now, if you look at the factors that control this, so on the one hand, you have this substantial pressure that people want to come to the richer countries. On the other hand, you have strong attitudes in richer countries. They don't want to have unlimited immigration. The United States, until the early 20th century, basically had unlimited immigration. Anybody could come, and millions upon millions of people did come. There was continuing opposition to that, particularly toward the end of the 19th century. Eventually, we passed the 1920s very restrictive laws. All countries have very restrictive laws. What's interesting is that the criteria used is very different. So here, I look at the net immigration to different countries, and I selected out a few, clearly the UK, US, and the like, and the criteria used. Now, you might think that that allowing people to come in because they have skills or other factors like that would be the major criteria. But for a lot of political economy reasons, that's not so. So if you look at the U.S., I'll start with the U.S., even though I'm speaking here in the UK. Start with the U.S. I know the data for the U.S. well, but it's quite different than from some of the other countries. The U.S., almost nobody as a fraction comes in for work-related reasons. I mean, to me, it's a terribly silly way of allowing entry. Most come in for family reunification, and for humanitarian makes some sense, of course, and others. So the fact that we're allowing people in for family reunification and for humanitarian reasons is perfectly fine and understandable, but that's such a small fraction of coming in towards largely an empty country on work-related reasons. That is a surprising factor. If you look at other countries, it varies a lot. Canada, somewhat larger fraction. UK, a much larger fraction on work-related reasons. So there's considerable variation in the reasons by which immigrants can attain access. But generally speaking, all the rich countries have limits on who can come, and they use a variety of criteria. This is one breakdown of the criteria that is being used. Now, some of my libertarian friends, and I have a lot of sympathy to, in most areas to libertarian views, some of them have said to me, well, shouldn't we just go back to the way the 19th century, what the U.S. policy in the 19th century, and allow unlimited immigration? Look at all the great value we've obtained from immigrants. And I'm second to no one in believing that immigrants have been a huge source of value for most countries, and certainly for the United States. My wife is an immigrant. My parents were immigrants, and there's not hardly an American you won't find if you go back a short few generations where you don't find they had immigrant ancestors. But the world is very different now than it was in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And the differences really come down to government. The welfare state, it's human nature, it's economics, if you will, it's human behavior. Use any of these terms, But if you can move to a country and get a lot of benefits, it's true, not everybody will move for those benefits, but a significant fraction of people will move to try to take advantage of those benefits. Okay? So the welfare state makes it very unattractive to go back to the policies we had at that time. But there's another aspect. Even if you had rules, let's say, excluding the welfare, limiting how soon immigrants can collect a lot of the benefits, and it's very hard to implement such rules politically. Even if you had such rules, and even if they could be implemented, there's another factor here. The governments are big, and immigrants become voters, and they influence the outcomes of elections. And therefore, there's a lot of concern about, what will be the political affiliations of immigrants, and how will they influence government spending, and will they push for this type of spending or that type? And so those two reasons means it's not realistic, it's not even desirable to go back to the model of unlimited immigration. How much value I place and how much value I think immigrants have contributed to different societies. So the question then one has to address is, given that, what should one do? Should we follow the present policies that are a mixture, a variety of interest group-based limitations? So, for example, we have in the United States a system which we call H-1B immigrants who can come in as skilled workers, many of them usually from Asia. They can come in for 3 years and stay for 6 years. So it doesn't seem very threatening. It doesn't even seem to be the optimal way to go. Nevertheless, Congress, U.S. Congress, has pushed that back so only 90,000 can come in a year under that on the H-1B visa program. 90,000. So it means by the end of January, the quota is filled. I mean, literally, that's a fact. The quota is filled by the end of January because so many more people want to come than can come in. So it doesn't seem to be the right way to go about doing it. So we have these arbitrary rules, and the question is, what can we do? I could mention illegal immigration is largely the result of the fact that you can't come legally, so some people come illegally. In the U.S. has a large number of Mexican immigrants, and UK has a large number of immigrants from various parts outside the EU where entry is more restrictive. All right, so then one comes, well, given the system, how can we improve the system? Accepting the fact and emphasizing that most immigrants add a lot to countries. They're conscientious, they're hardworking, they do unpopular jobs, they add skills. Now they have some negative sides. Crime rates are often higher among immigrants, and some other problems that you're all familiar with. So the question that I have tried to think about is how can one maximize and preserve the advantages of having immigrants and reduce the disadvantages? And so I have a very simple proposal. I mean, naively simple, you might say. Sell the right to immigrant. Set a price, government set a price each year. Anyone would be accepted aside from obvious undesirables, potential terrorists, criminals, maybe people who are very sick and would be immediately big burden to the health system. But aside from that, you allow anybody who can meet the payments would be allowed to immigrate. Okay? No country has ever adopted that policy. You might say the U.S. policy in the 19th century, anybody can immigrate, you had a zero price, and anybody can immigrate at a zero price. But nobody has really ever adopted a system of allowing anybody to immigrate if they can meet the price. Now you might say, well, one reason nobody's adopted it because it's a dumb proposal. But I'm going to try to convince you that it's not a dumb proposal, that it makes a lot of sense, and it meets a lot of the objections that people who dislike having immigrants have. It also, I think, caters to the people like to see not only the numbers we're getting, but more immigrants. I think, for example, the U.S. should allow more immigration. So I think it's not perfect, but I think it can meet both those problems. What would be the advantage? So I'm going to come to a little later in what the price might be. I'm just going to pick a number. I don't know exactly what the price would be. Suppose you set that price. I'm going to use hypothetically later on $50,000 for the U.S., and you'd be roughly a related figure for the U.K. What would happen? Well, the first question to ask, who would be most willing to pay that price? Well, you can think of different groups. The more skilled, because the gain from moving from a poorer country to a richer country for the more skilled in dollars is substantially greater than the gain in dollars, or I should say pounds here in the UK, in pounds for moving from a poor country to a rich country. So if you look at a lot of the skilled people, say, coming from India or China, we ration them a lot in most countries. They would gain $20,000 to $30,000 as an engineer graduates from the IIT in India, one of the Indian Institutes of Technology, very fine places to be trained as engineers. They would increase their income at the minimum by $30,000 a year in the United States, and maybe a somewhat smaller figure, but a substantial figure in the UK. All right? So if the cost was $50,000, it would be a great deal. In 2 or 3 years, they could repay their entire loan. And it would be even quicker for a lot of them. So skilled immigrants would clearly be attracted. Those are, in many respects, very desirable. The young would be attracted for obvious reasons, that they would have a longer time to collect the benefits. So young people who have a lot of dynamism in a country, have a lot of the new ideas, who are energetic, who want their families to improve in the future, they would be attracted because they would gain a lot. My third bullet point is important, sometimes neglected. You really want immigrants who want to make a commitment to the country. This is the country they expect to be in. Now, some of them will be disappointed, they'll go back, but they expect to be in this country. They want to make a commitment to the culture. They may preserve some of their own culture. They want to make a commitment to the culture of the country, to the mores of the country. They want their children to make that commitment. Those are the immigrants who would find such a system most attractive, who would be willing to pay the most for it because they would expect to be staying the longest. So you look at these first three categories that we have: skilled people, young people, those who want to make a commitment. They would all be the ones who would be most likely to be willing to make such a pay. Now think about the opposition to immigration. The government, it's often said in different countries opposed to immigrants, immigrants come here, they get a free ride. They come in, they make use of all the health services and the educational system and other benefits, and they're getting a free ride, and that's why we want to reduce the amount of immigration. Well, in the system I'm proposing, they're not getting a free ride. They're paying for the right to come. All right? They're adding revenue. Here, the UK and the US and many other countries now, as a result of the financial crisis, are in a period where revenue is really an important issue. We're running large deficits. And so here you would have immigrants contributing revenue. Yes, they may take some benefits out, although they'll be working. As I said, they're younger, they're more skilled. So their use of the welfare benefits are going to be really slight. Some of them will use them, but they're contributing revenue. And when the anti-immigration groups see the revenue coming in, they won't necessarily eliminate their hostility to immigration, but it will, I think for many people, reduce their hostility to immigrate. I think that's another important factor. Another bullet point is illegal immigration is an important problem in many countries, even in Japan. Japan basically doesn't like immigrants and has almost zero net immigration in any year. But they have a lot of illegal immigrants. And when Didi and I were in Japan not that long ago, there was a lot of complaints about a lot of people who come in on tourist visas, from the Philippines, from China, and they stay on. Illegal immigrants come because they can't get in illegally. All right. Now, a number of people who are here illegally in any one country, like UK, US, Germany, wherever it may be, will reason the following, I think. If I became a legalized immigrant, which I could do by paying this price, I would have much better opportunities than as an illegal immigrant. Illegal immigrants can work, but they're limited in the type of jobs they can have. They're in the underground economy pretty much entirely. And when you're in the underground economy, we know from casual evidence from a lot of studies that the underground economy is generally low-skilled jobs, lower-paying jobs, and so on, because if you're firm with using skilled workers, you really can't function effectively being underground. It's much harder to do so, right? So they would say, look, I can convert myself to legal status by ponying up the amount required. So not all of them would do that, of course, but those particularly want to make a long-term commitment to the country would be doing it. So you wouldn't eliminate the illegal problem by any means, but I think you would moderate it, and possibly substantially, and you'll moderate it in the right direction. The illegal immigrants who you want in many respects, who want to make this commitment, want their children to have the opportunities, they're the ones who would be willing to convert themselves to legal status. Now, so people naturally would ask, and I would ask that if I first heard this proposal, well, what about poor immigrants who cannot afford to pay? I don't believe you want to exclude poor immigrants, particularly the poor, ambitious immigrants who see themselves as benefiting not only themselves but their children by moving to another country. They're willing to work hard and save a lot because they're taking a long-run perspective. All right, but you don't want to exclude those immigrants. It would be a foolish policy, I think, if those immigrants couldn't come. So I think you have to think creatively about mechanisms by which you can help the poor immigrants finance the charge, let's say the $50,000 charge. One way is to think of this similarly to student loan programs. Student loan programs help mainly poorer students finance their higher education, and then they pay back over a number of years the amount they borrowed. Well, think of having an immigration loan program. Student loan programs are programs that enable poorer students to invest in their human capital in the form of education. Immigration loan programs would enable poorer immigrants to invest in their human capital in the form of moving to a country that offers them more opportunities. So it would be very analogous in many ways. Another possibility would be that although the immigrant would have to be the ones directly paying for this, one way they might finance that is by making a contract with a company who pays it directly for them, and they're committed to working for the company for a certain number of years, or in lieu of that, if they decide they want to move to another company, then repaying it at that time. So it's a kind of system that some countries have. You take a country like Brazil, and we've had a number of students from Brazil in the United States studying at the University of Chicago, economics and business. And Brazilian government has a program whereby they'll finance the education, say at Chicago, for the student. But the student has to make a commitment that when they come back to, say, Brazil, they have to work for a certain number of years in certain specified activities, either at central bank or a university or some other forms of activity. And they decide not to do that, they can repay the loan. So they give them the option. And the same, similarly, what you would have here. The company might help them finance the loan, but they would have the ability, if they decide to leave the company, they could get better earnings elsewhere, then they could repay it. Maybe the new company would help them finance it. So there are lots of flexibility. Once you start thinking along these lines, there are lots of ways you can think by which the poor individuals who are immigrating would not be excluded from this market, could participate fully in this market. Okay? So how would it work? The first Of course, you'd have to determine a price, and that would depend upon mainly two variables. How many immigrants did you want to admit? And that would be a decision that you would have to make. Governments would have to make that. And how the number of applicants would vary with price. So if the number of applicants didn't vary much with price, you'd get more revenue and not much fewer applicants by setting a higher price. If it varied a lot, you'd have to take into account that if you raise the price more, you'd get many fewer immigrants. So you'd have to take account of those two factors and end up with a price. Now, I make some calculations for the United States, not only because I'm more confident I know the data for the United States better, but you can easily substitute my numbers here for Great Britain. U.S. has been admitting about 1 million a year in legal immigrants. Number of illegal immigrants is really not known, although there are various ways to estimate that. So the question is, what, for example, equilibrium price would lead to 1 million immigrants wanting to come each year? Because many more than 1 million immigrants want to come to the U.S. every year. Probably we could get 3 million or more immigrants if we allowed them in, and maybe 5 million. I mean, that's how much excess demand there is. So I say, suppose the price, I don't know what the price would be, but suppose it was $50,000. I'll try to justify why that's probably not too high a price, maybe it's even too low. This would yield $50 billion a year in tax revenue. Now, the U.S. has a big government deficit. 50 million won't eliminate this deficit, but it's not peanuts either, because it's 50 million per year, so in present value, it's worth a lot in terms of the deficit. Let's say at 5% interest rate, that's roughly a present value of $1 trillion. So it's a lot of money, okay? So it could raise a significant revenue. That's where the opposition to immigration then begins to say, well, they're helping to pay some of our taxes. Maybe it's not such a bad idea to have more immigrants coming into this country. Now, maybe the price is higher than $50,000. Why would I say that? Well, you think of how much many immigrants earn by coming to UK or US, and how much they would earn if they stayed where they were, whether it's India or China or Pakistan or not. So if you take, as I mentioned before, an IIT graduate, now that's at the skill level to be sure, they would increase their income annually maybe $30,000 a year. In 2 years they would pay for, less than 2 years they would pay you the $50,000. It would be nothing. I mean, they could borrow it and pay it off briefly, and then they'd have a lot left over. And nonetheless, they would be adding a lot of value. Now, of course, if they're a lower skill level, their gain from coming would be a lot less. But even an unskilled worker, you look at an unskilled worker, how much higher an unskilled worker can make here than they can make in Pakistan, how much an unskilled worker can make in the U.S. than they can make in Mexico, which is a big source of immigration to the U.S., it's substantial. It's several thousand dollars a year would be the increase, maybe $5,000 to $10,000 for an unskilled worker, because it pays so much better. So they could pay it off quite quickly. So my guess would be you get more immigrants coming in each year at a price higher than $50,000, and more than 1 million immigrants coming in each year at a price higher than $50,000. So the revenue potential is great, but the main purpose of the proposal is not simply revenue. It's to give you a criteria by which you can select immigrants who have many advantages for the country they're coming to, advantages that go far beyond the money they're supplying in terms of skill level, age, commitment, and the like. So I have here a couple of more considerations. There are a lot of technical details that have to be worked out. Some people have argued, well, you should have companies buy right. I think it's better to let the individuals buy the right to immigrate rather than putting in the hand of companies. And then they can move across. Companies may help them pay, and they can move across companies, but basically it would be in the hand of individuals. but they would have the option of contacting companies. You have to worry, well, suppose people are coming with children. Should you have differential pricing for children? Maybe. Spouses? Yes. I'd pay a lot more for my spouse coming than if I would for myself, but and some people, not everybody would have that judgment, maybe. Maybe you want to have skilled differential in pricing. I mean, this gets a little, I think better to start with a simple system, but maybe there's competition for skilled workers, you want to have differential pricing. So there are a lot of issues that one can discuss. My goal tonight is to put forward a proposal, try to outline what I think are the major structure of the proposal, the advantages of the proposal. So let me conclude. Conclusions are very simple. There's great desire to immigrate to most of the rich countries, particularly UK, US, Germany, Japan. Many arbitrary rules are used to limit the number of immigrants. So you have an excess, what we call in economics, an excess demand for the right to immigrate, because we're setting these rules and we're rationing entry into the country. The solution, when economists see excess demand, if you see there's more demand for cars than there is supply, you raise the price. Companies raise the price. In a competitive system or any system, they'll raise the price. In recent years, there's been the reverse being true. There's more supply of cars than demand for cars, and companies have lowered the price. They offer 0% financing and a variety of other discounts. All right, so that's a natural way of markets operate. Well, think of now immigration as a market. You have excess demand to come here. You think of market concepts. Market concept is, well, your price is too low. Raise the price. That's really what's involved in doing this. And look for a price. We're given the number you want to, immigrants you want to produce, so to speak. You have the price that you get the number of immigrants wanting to come that matches that price. Now, doing that, you might think, well, by doing that, I'm going to get the worst sort of immigrants. No, you're going to get the better sort of immigrants for the most part. You can get, as I mentioned, I'll repeat that. The young, the skilled, those who have the greatest commitment, illegals converting themselves to legal status, you're going to get the better sort of immigrants coming. So you can have your cake and eat it too. You get the revenue, and you get the immigration, and you get the better sort of immigrants. So it seems to me it's a win-win situation all over, and therefore it seems to me it's a policy that there's always political opposition to new ideas, but it seems to me it's a kind of policy that has a lot of attractions, and hopefully when the idea spreads and when the difficulty of adopting a viable and effective immigration policy in other ways becomes more and more apparent, that countries will begin to think about using price to restrict immigration or charging immigrants for the right to come. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, now we've got an opportunity for questions. They've arranged to shine two bright lights into my eyes, so I may not be able to see all that well. We've got a couple of roving microphones, I think, downstairs and one upstairs, so I'll try and ration them out to people who want to ask a question. When the microphone reaches you, please give your name, if you would, before asking your question. And as usual, we'd like questions, not comments, and preferably fairly short questions rather than very long ones. Okay, now there's a couple of people going to come round with the roving microphones, I think. Oh, I see, you're at the back, right-ho. What about this gentleman on the aisle here? What about the one in the middle over there?
Thank you very much. My name is Graham Smith. Given that the...
Where's the questioner? I can't...
I'm sorry, I'm here.
Okay.
Given that the starting point of calculating the price is still that the government has to decide how many it wants to admit. Isn't it at least possible that a government that's attracted by a scheme of this sort would say, well, I can avoid all the difficulty of trying to calculate an equilibrium price by setting a quota and auctioning the quota? Now, if you see your proposal as preferable to that, how would you go about persuading a government of that?
Well, they're very much related proposals, and I don't really have strong preferences for one or the other. You can think of starting with quantity and seeing what price you can get, or you start with price and you think of quantity, and they're fundamentally very closely related. Think of the following comparison. You can either put a tax on carbon emissions, or you can set a quota and sell the quota or give the quota away. And under various conditions, they're equivalent ways. So an alternative way, basically the same system, is you auction off the quota and you get the feedback from the demand, the price at which they're willing to pay, and maybe next year you set a higher or lower quota. And similarly, the comparable issue would be with the system I'm proposing. They set a price, maybe they get less demand than they would like, or they get more people who are willing to pay that price. So they say, well, next year we'll raise the price some because we can attract the number we're seeking to get at a higher price. So they're equivalent methods. I don't have strong opinion about which one would be better. They're both good. If one could sell it to the political specialists on the auction system, I'm all for it.
Okay. Someone should have a microphone over there.
Yeah, I do already. One thing that instantly attracts me to the plan is the fact that you, with perhaps George Borjas, are probably the most reviled economist amongst the left wing, which obviously makes it a great selling point. But how do we sell it to those economists and the political economists, the politicians? As you said, how on earth do we sell this plan? Is it incremental, or is it just, here's $50 billion to plug your hole? Which one's the better argument for them?
Yeah. Well, I'm a believer in the division of labor. Over my career, I've tried to come up with ideas, and I leave it to the IEA and other think tanks and other people to do the selling. Now, I do write a little bit for the popular media, and I have a blog, and I wrote for Business Week for 19 years. But I feel my contribution is to come up with the idea. How would it be sold? I think it would be sold basically by think tanks and others picking up this idea and putting it in a way that would be more attractive politically. I mean, all of these things have to be sold politically. Put it in a way that makes it more attractive politically. Have it discussed for a while, because there's particularly in the academic field, and even my great teacher and great friend, Milton Friedman, at one time had the view, all you had to do was come up with the right answer, the politicians would jump to accept that answer. Well, he learned over the years that's not how things work. The way I think things work is when a policy gets bad enough, people look around, including people in the political sector, look around, what's a better way of treating it? So when we had airline regulation, and that was really leading to a tremendous number of inefficiencies, and people began to write in the academic world and in the think tank world and the popular media, you know, that the regulations were counterproductive. We were restricting entry. No new airlines were allowed in the United States, interstate airlines, for like 40 years. And we had a lot of other difficulties. And so then it collapsed. And when it collapses, it always comes as a surprise. But it collapsed, it collapsed under President Carter, who was no particular friend of free markets. But it came at that time. So I think you need the idea to be picked up by people who are specialists and good at putting these ideas in ways that are more appealing to the general public and to people in politics. And is that possible? Yes. It's easy to state. I don't think I used a single technical term in everything I said this evening. I could do it. I could write down equations and do all that to express it. You don't have to do it. You can do it very simply in simple language. And I think simple programs are much easier I believe, to sell. So I think it's sellable. It'll be not going to happen tomorrow, but I think one has to look ahead when one's thinking about ideas, and whether it might happen in 5 years, 10 years. If it happened in 10 years, I'd really feel great. I mean, that's a short horizon from the way ideas percolate throughout a system.
Okay, there's a chap up the back there. Can we get him a microphone? There's a man down here. Can we get him a microphone? And I think the next speaker is actually at the back over there.
Good evening. My name is Nicholas Constantinesco. I was wondering, isn't the US actually already experimenting with this de facto in a couple of ways? One is, I believe you can get a green card by investing either $500,000 or $1 million into building a business. And second is, you can also buy your way into the US if you get into university, for example. And we all know it's usually quite expensive to get into, to pay for university over there. So on the basis of that, could we compare the impact of at least these two experiments, let's say, that are happening in the US with other countries where such ways of buying one's way into it don't exist?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's, the fraction of individuals who come in the US on the buying their way in is minute. Those who offer like $200,000 or $300,000 to come in, who have to invest it in certain industries. That's also true in Canada, but it's a tiny fraction of the total. So we're not using that system that way. Now you say, are we using it in terms of people who come to study in the United States? No. Yes, it makes it somewhat easier if you come to study in the US, but I have many former students who've had to go back because they could not convert their student visas into permanent visas. So it's an easy way to do it. Indirectly you're paying, but you're getting an education at the same time. And one of the crimes of the US policy is we're getting all this talent in who come for undergraduate, mainly for graduate studies. And we don't allow them to automatically stay in, maybe by buying their way in. I think that's a crime, that we restrict the access so substantially to the students who come. We can attract a tremendous number of able students. 2/3 of the graduate students in the economics department at Chicago are now from outside the United States. A significant fraction of them go back, partly because they have good opportunities elsewhere, that's fine, but also partly because the US makes it difficult for them to stay, and I think that's the bad part. That's what my system would solve.
Gentleman up at the back.
Professor Becker, my name is Eric Benson. My question is about default. So it would seem to me that a lot of people may not be able to pay this, particularly in the US or Europe where it's fairly expensive. And what happens if they can't? Do they go home? Do they become economic refugees?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I've thought a little bit about that problem. The way I think the system would work would be that people have to put some kind of down payment down. So you couldn't borrow, let's say it's $50,000. You couldn't borrow the whole $50,000. You'd have to put some down payment down, maybe $5,000, maybe even $10,000 down. And then there's an expression we use in the United States, I don't know if you use it here in Brigham, you have skin in the game. All right, so you have some skin in the game by putting that money down. So the default, yes, there'll be some people defaulting, and you'll have to work. Do you send them back? Do you redo the loans? In student loans in the United States, you cannot default on a student loan. You cannot default on a student loan. The government naturally always gives themselves an advantage when it comes to default possibilities. You can default on a lot of other things. You can't default either on your taxes or on your student loan. Now, you may de facto default by just not paying, but you cannot go bankrupt and discharge your student loan possibility. So I would think the analogy with student loans would be the way I would attack that problem. There'll be some difficult cases that you're going to have to deal with, whether you send them back as a way we send illegal immigrants back or do something else. I mean, that has to be worked out. But one possibility is you send them back if they defaulted on their loan.
Okay, the gentleman down here, please.
Professor Becker, my name is Barry McLeod-Cullinane. I'm an elected local politician. So some of what you're saying is of real interest because here in London we see a lot of people who are smuggled into the country, particularly from China and Far Eastern countries. And they often end up working in sex trade occupations because they pay traffickers to get them into the country. They're locked out of the normal white market, and where do they go? And this sounds like a way that actually you would lift people out of that situation, solving a problem for politicians, but also it would remove the people traffickers that are blighting so many people's lives. Have you actually looked at that aspect of your proposals?
I looked a little bit at it. I'm glad you raised that question. I looked at it not in the British context, but in the U.S. There's a lot of smuggling from Mexico into the United States, so it would be similar sort of smuggling. And they're called mules. These are the guides who pay them, who get paid to smuggle these people in. And I had a student once did a paper on what the pay was for these mules and how it varied with different economic circumstances. And yes, a lot of people come in under awful conditions, you know, and there have been examples where people have died being smuggled in and so on. I think these people would be put out of business mainly put out of business if my proposal went through. I wouldn't say 100% out of business, but they'd be mainly put out of business. And the people wouldn't have to go through those circumstances. They would then seek, well, look, I get smuggled in, I have to pay for this, and not a small amount by, say, Mexican standards. And then if I'm caught, I'm thrown out again. So some people come in, cross 4 or 5 times. You add up what they're paying, a lot of these people, I believe, would elect, say, I'm going to pay up front, I'm illegal now, I can get good jobs, I'll earn a lot more, and then we do away with that business of smuggling. You know, nature abhors a vacuum, and that's true in the economic sphere as well as elsewhere. You have rationing, there are people who go into business finding ways around the rationing, and that's what these people do. Unfortunately, they often do it in very unattractive ways. You bring people in for prostitution and a lot of problems. I'm not saying that's going to be 100% solved, but I think it will go a considerable distance towards solving that problem.
Okay, now we've got one down here in the front. We've got one down here in the front. Is there anyone up at the back who wants to ask a question? Yes, okay, that gentleman there. Let's go to the lady here first.
Professor Becker, Jonathan Weiss, 2 questions. Don't we risk pricing?
Where are you? I can't see where you're at. Sorry. I'd like to be able to see where the question's coming from.
Don't we risk pricing out of the market net non-economic contributors like artists, writers, teachers, nurses, et cetera? And as a corollary to the point raised above, isn't there a loophole unless the Constitution is changed in that there's an incentive to have children so that they automatically become U.S. citizens and thereby can get in through the back door family allowance?
Yeah, well, the children can be citizens, but that doesn't automatically make the parents citizens. The Constitution says anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, but it doesn't say that makes their parents citizens. Their parents still have to go through regular devices to become citizens of the country. So in terms, what was I got diverted by that. What was the main part of your question?
It was more that would then allow the parents to claim a family to get by through a loophole of application through the family route. And the other part was in terms of non-economic contributors, so yeah, okay. Artists, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, on the family side, that's really easy to answer. The other one is a little more difficult. In one of my slides, I pointed out that one would have to think about, well, what do you do with people who want to bring in their spouses or their children? Should they be allowed to bring in at the same price? Probably not. You have to pay, if you bring in more people, you have to pay more. Maybe not proportionally, but you would have to pay more. So I don't think that's a difficult problem. I think that could be solved. On the issue, you're right. On the issue of artists and the like, that's more complicated. There'll be some fields where they're offering more what we call non-pecuniary benefits. But most of the occupations you mentioned, including a lot of artists who come in, would be well able to pay this price, like nurses. We have a lot of nurses from Jamaica in the United States. They do so much better in the United States in terms of earnings than they do in Jamaica, that we'd get more nurses rather than fewer, because we ration how many of these nurses can come in. We get more of them coming in rather than fewer. Even in artists are coming, it's nice to think of the artist as indifferent to money and just working for his work. I mean, there'd be some artists who are that and wouldn't be able to sell, and you might lose some of them. How do they get in under the present circumstances? It's difficult for them to get in on present. A lot of artists would say, well, better opportunities, not only in terms of selling my art, but in terms of art schools and the like, and other artists to associate. They're better here than they are where I'm coming from. And I think it would be more attractive rather than less attractive.
Okay, can we get a microphone to this lady down at the front, please? The gentleman over here, did you get... Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Go to you next, and then we'll go upstairs.
Richard Alston. I'm interested in the interaction with the welfare system. Do you assume that would you see a need for restrictions for access to the welfare system, or do you assume that effectively the people who are going to come in would be very keen to stay well away from welfare? And if that's the case, would there be a significant saving to government, which you'd add on to your $50 billion?
Yeah. Well, some people might pay who would coming in to take advantage of the welfare system. I mean, it could be, but they will pay a significant sum to do that. Now, people who come in and take advantage of the welfare system haven't paid anything to come in. On the other hand, I think most of the immigrants who would come in under this system would be people who would need, at least for a while, the welfare system, because they'd be skilled workers, they'd be young workers, and so on, and they wouldn't take advantage of the welfare system. Maybe if they became unemployed, they would get unemployment compensation. So I think for the most part, it would be two prongs that would both, I think, be favorable. On the one hand, if people came to take advantage of the welfare system, at least they would have paid a considerable sum to take advantage of it. And number two, that the type of people who would be attracted, would be willing to pay that, would be mainly people who would need to take advantage of the welfare system because they'd be earning a lot, they'd be relatively healthy, and the like.
I think there's a gentleman up at the back. Did you ever get the microphone?
Hi, Anthony Trico. I'm wondering about, is there a presumption in your solution that permanent migration is necessarily better than temporary migration? And if so, it seems to fly in the face of changing trends in migration with globalization, where people might go for a few years to a country, study, do some work, go back, and particularly in regard to migration from developing countries, where we think of it as being a good thing that people come to other countries and experience other cultures and go back, it might massively exacerbate brain drains and other problems.
Yeah. Well, I do believe on the whole people who come permanently are more valuable to a country. And I'm thinking from the country's perspective, not from the country sending perspective. They are more valuable. They make a commitment to the country. I think it's better to have people, citizens in the country who are making commitment to this country, whatever it may be, than people who are only coming and don't get involved in learning anything about the Constitution or the other laws of the country, who don't want their children to really participate in learning about the country. So I think on the whole, yes, I do. I was explicit about that. I think that's a value, and it's a positive value. Now, that doesn't mean anybody who comes will stay forever. Suppose you take somebody coming from India. They come for 10 years. Okay? They can't come now, let's say. They come for 10 years. They earn a lot. They pay the $50,000. They have some surplus left over. They can take any job they want. They're coming legally. And then they decide, well, the good opportunities opened up for them in India, so they go back. So, you know, sunk costs are sunk. That's a basic principle of economics. Sunk costs are sunk. They would say, well, looking ahead, what's better for me? Are my opportunities in India now, or my opportunities to continue in the United States? So some people would do that. That's fine. I have no objection to that. Some of them would do that. But for the most part, you'd get people making the commitment. And I think mainly you want people who are making commitment to the country rather than people who are coming temporarily.
Linda.
Linda Whetstone. You've answered one part of my question. The other was, what about humanitarian, immigration for humanitarian reasons? I'm sure you'll have thought about it, and there would have to be some other provision for that.
Yes, I mean, clearly humanitarian reasons are significant. They're a really small, if you look at the data that I presented, they were a small fraction of the total immigrants for the most part. I forgot what, I think the US, it was around, no, humanitarian. Here we have the figures. So 17% of the US came in on humanitarian reasons, 9% in the UK, and 3% in Germany, for a little over 4% in France. So for most countries, it's not a major factor. And clearly, you might want to make exceptions for humanitarian reasons, but you have to be sure, you have to be sure they're really humanitarian reasons. A lot of people claim refugee status, and they don't really have it. They claim they'll be if they went back to the country, they would be in trouble. Those people you're really confident about. Yes, and you would have some exceptions. Maybe you'd have a lower price, because even people come for humanitarian reasons. That doesn't mean they're not going to work and earn money, right? So you're getting to a smaller and smaller subset. Those people coming from truly humanitarian reasons who maybe are too old to earn anything, and you make some exceptions for that group. But it's going to be a tiny fraction of the total coming, I believe.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. So I'd now like to ask Michael Hinze, the trustee of the IEA and the chief executive of CQS Management, who sponsored this evening's event, to propose a vote of thanks.
It's a real pleasure and privilege for CQS to be sponsoring the Hayek Memorial Lecture once again. Let's be clear, to evolve and progress, civil society must recognise the value of ideas and analysis. The IEA has been consistent in arguing the case for a fairer and better society through free markets. This must be done not in slogans and sound bites, but through thought, analysis and informed discussion, such as we've had here tonight. It has been a pleasure to listen to this. Now, it is important to be able to explore these ideas, and this is certainly a crucial time in our society globally to think about the battle of ideas. It is a crucial time. It is a battle that's being fought between free markets and excessive regulation, between individual responsibility and the state, and economic mobility and entrapment. A crucial thing that we need to think about as in our current world. I'm delighted that under Mark Littlewood, our new Director General, the IEA has taken the decision to increase its engagement with the press and the public so as to promote the fundamental ideals of free society through informed analysis. The IEA has a wide and deep-ranging group of authors conducting rigorous academic research. It is peer-reviewed. It is academic research based on facts and analysis, not ideology. And we've taken this opportunity to provide some examples of these on your seats. Now, it is a great pleasure to be able to thank Professor Gary Becker for his challenging thoughts on a topic that now provokes such strong political and social debate. It is very right to think about these issues. Professor, it is an honour to have been here tonight with you. Your distinguished and substantial work on human capital and its components is definitive in the field. The conclusions you have drawn help us, I believe, as a civil society, think about these issues. I'm delighted we've had the opportunity to hear you speak this evening. On behalf of myself, CQS, the IEA, and everyone here, thank you.